This Hang Out on Air is live, and it says we can go for 8 hours, but we're not planning to go for 8 hours. Just dive into world building. And today's topic is alien senses, which should be kind of fun, because this is very science fictional. But I think I might be able to take it in some interesting directions that aren't necessarily science fictional. So
Cool.
we'll just see how we go. So when I think about alien senses and world building, I think to myself, well, there are two ways to approach it. One is to say, what is a world like that develops creatures with senses that are not like ours? And then the other one would be, if you are taking the point of view of an alien whose senses are not like ours, what would your world appear to you as, and what would it be like? So I think those are kind of separate questions. Does that make sense? I guess perhaps we could talk about for a moment kinds of alien senses that we've run into and things that we've read. Surely Raj has got a list of these in his head.
Yeah, I do, but it might even be interesting to start right here on Earth. Consider,
yeah, that's true too.
Consider the mantis shrimp.
Okay.
Okay.
Why don't you tell us what to consider about the mantis shrimp?
The mantis shrimp has, just in terms of the eyes, they have, I forgot how many different kinds of receptors they have. I think it's something like 24.
Mm-hmm.
Butterflies, the monarch butterfly has, I think, 16. We have 3. Cats have 2. So our world, in terms of the colors that we can perceive, are an order of magnitude greater than what a cat can perceive in terms of the colors. Not exactly an order of magnitude. It's exponential, but though, because all the combinations of colors that wind up in our perceptions don't exist in the cat's world. So,
right.
So you think about a mantis shrimp, and you see all these things, color blends of maybe ultraviolet with whatever.
Yeah.
It's a staggering thing, and the world of the ultraviolet alone is amazing if you consider that, like a flower, if you see it in ultraviolet light, most of them have targets on them that are invisible to us, visible to bees.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing that probably we could consider in terms of alien senses, just enhancing the ones that we have in a similar way.
Well, so okay, let's yes, I agree. I agree. It's good to consider ultraviolet and expanding our sense of what's going on our world. What I wonder about though is let's think for a second about how that would change our portrayal of a world, because in a way you could say, well, in a world where there's no light, other senses will develop, right? Or in a world where there is no X, Y, or Z, we could say these different kinds of things will develop because it would make sense that people would have to have a better sense of touch, right, if they couldn't see in this particular range or whatever it happens to be. On the other hand, if we're saying, okay, the world is not changed, the world is as we perceive it, except that there's more to it that we're not perceiving, then that becomes a very interesting question for a writer. How do you articulate with the point of view? I'm assuming that you would have to be articulating with a point of view rather than just, well, I don't know, omniscient, I suppose, but it would be an omniscient non-human if that were the case. What would be the approach for saying, okay, well, I perceive this world in the following way? And yeah, you could talk about how you see targets on the flowers.
Well, think about the languages. There may be entire visual languages that are possible.
Okay.
So you could, for example, it might be that you develop languages based on color, kind of photo displays on your body that would actually turn into the languages.
That's cool.
Yeah. Well, this does lead me to say something about
Like squid and cuttlefish?
squid and cuttlefish. Yeah, they changed the colors of their skin to communicate.
Oh.
Which is pretty cool.
Yeah, they're awesome.
Yeah. Have you guys? Oh no, you probably. I mean, who in this group is local to my area? I don't think anybody. There's a great display on right now at the Monterey Bay Aquarium.
No.
Called Tentacles. Yeah, it's a place that a lot of people know though because it's also known as the what was it? Sausalito Cetacean Institute.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, so they have a really fantastic display right now on squid and cuttlefish and octopi and nautiluses and all kinds of really cool stuff.
Want.
Yeah, I wish you guys could come over here and see it. We could all go together. It would be fun. Anyway.
I'd have to drive a few hours to get there.
A few days.
Yeah, I think Reggie'd probably have a pretty rough time getting over here.
Yeah.
Especially given the conditions in her area at this time.
Oh yeah, mountain and snow.
Anyway, but yeah, you might go and look at it online. I suppose they might have some information about it online. It's pretty cool. Anyway, so okay, this is great. I'm just playing around. Okay, so we have words to describe light, and this is something that so okay. There's a really interesting pattern that you find in human languages when it comes to describing color. Okay? Because not all languages have the same number of words for colors, but they tend to fall into a particular type of pattern. And this is what it looks like. If there are only 2 words for color, they are light and dark. If there are only 3 words for color, they are light and dark and red. If there are only 4 words for color, they are white and black and red and blue-green. And are you seeing the pattern here? And then once you get past that, then the array becomes more complex. And I'm not talking about aubergine or sand blossom or the kinds of things that you see on paint swatches. I'm talking about the standard words that people use to describe colors that they see. And basically, the reason why this pattern exists across languages is that it fits with levels of discrimination in the human eye. So that's going to be a commonality that appears across the world because everybody's eye structure is effectively similar. And so this is kind of something that occurs to me because of what Raj was talking about. And we get to a point where we run out of words to describe light, right? Because we have violet, and then we're at a loss, and we go ultraviolet, right? Or we have red, and then we go okay, infrared, right? And so we're building on this existing structure to create words for our colors. On the other hand, it's going to be a real challenge if you are having to use a completely different word to describe a color that humans can't perceive.
I've
Right?
had to do it.
Well, I'm sure you have, but it is an interesting challenge, right? So, what did you do, Raj? Just
What I did was I put emotional investment in it, described it in terms of, well, there's several things I did. A book of mine called Opening Wonders has the main character all of a sudden being able to develop, has the ability suddenly to see two different colors that never existed. And there's a reason for it, that he can do this. That because normally you can't, if you're blind from birth, if your eyes are repaired so that they were physically working, you still aren't going to be able to see. You might be able to distinguish the difference between with great effort, a circle and a triangle, but you won't really see if there's much point to it. There's a lot of brain development that's involved in the perception of colors. And also, as a society, as the human societies have changed, our perceptions, just, and orange is a great example, there was no color orange until the fruit was brought to Europe. That's where the color orange came from. The orange was considered just a form of red. But anyway, so what I did was I took two approaches. One is I described one of the colors as a color that was blacker than black. And that's, and I kind of left it there. So it's something that had the essence of black, but it was just more so. And the other color, I just put some emotional investment in it, saying that it had this built-in energy that was constantly moving. And so I took extraneous factors that weren't involved in any normal description of color and put them in terms of color. And that kind of, I hope, would create the feel.
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging, right? So this is the kind of thing where if you are dealing with an alien point of view and you are dealing with colors that we don't have words for, it's actually very useful to think about how our perception, how our sense of vision is embedded linguistically. Because colors are a good example of this, but you can do it with auditory stuff, and you can do it with olfactory stuff. There's a sort of a vocabulary of sense. And
Well,
if you look at the way that people talk about their senses and their sensory experiences, then it gives you, I think it gives you some tools to talk about other kinds of senses, right?
I was thinking that what we call, this goes back to when we were talking about tentacles, that what we call touch is actually multiple things.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's hot, cold, hard, soft, rough, smooth.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And probably more that are not coming to my mind at the
Well,
moment.
painful and pleasant would be too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. And you could imagine that different textures would have feels to them, or be subclasses to themselves, that kind of thing. It's the tons of words for snow kind of concept. Now, mind you, that is not actually super accurate. The idea that, oh well, there's a lot of snow around, so we have lots of different words for it.
That turned out to be debunked anyway.
Well, I mean, it was debunked. In as much as it's not like there isn't some overarching concept of snow, right? On the other hand, people who specialize in a particular thing tend to have a lot of specialized vocabulary for it.
Yes. That's
Yeah,
true.
And
I
so,
actually looked that up one time, and it's more like just the quality of snow.
well, exactly.
Um, you know, fine powder, hard pack,
Hmm.
slush. It was just
That-
it's just those words, but more just to simply describe the quality of snow, not just having like 20 words for snow.
Right. It's all about making refined discrimination in type and those distinctions that people who just don't encounter snow wouldn't really understand can be a life or death issue in a place where, the different type of snow that's on the ground could mean, well, I can get out of this place safely or not, right? So what I'm trying to say by bringing up this issue of the quote-unquote 100 words for snow is not so much that you have 100 words that all mean the same thing in any context, but that one of the ways that you can explore an alternate sense, or in fact an alternate importance for an existing sense, is by looking at how people discriminate, right? And what kinds of things they discriminate and why. And um, Russian actually has more words for blue than English does. And it's literally related. I mean, as a result, English speakers, when asked to distinguish between these two forms of blue, will be like, well, I'm blue, or they might start describing, well, this one's a little more this, or this one's that. But whereas Russian speakers would say, well, this is blue, and this is the other thing, right? So it has to do with how we form our categories.
Yeah.
English-speaking painters, of course, do have elaborate, just like this confirms what you were saying, they have all sorts of ways of, and specialized ways of describing it based on pigments, in paint.
Mm-hmm.
Aquamarine, whatever.
Cobalt, Prussian,
Yep,
cerulean,
exactly.
azure hue. There's like, yeah, it is pigment based.
Yeah. And so okay, so there is that. There's a really big opportunity there, I think, to create more specialized language for senses. Whenever you're going to be using alien words, i.e., words that are not English words,
Hmm.
you have to be really, really careful because there's a chance that you're going to just lose your reader. Because the reader's like, I don't know what this is, right? So my rule of thumb for that is the closer you want the reader to feel to your alien, the more English you should use. And the more distant you want to feel from the alien, the more of the alien language you should use. Because there's a certain point at which it all breaks down and somebody goes, well, the story's supposed to be in English, why am I not understanding anything? Right?
Yeah.
And that does happen with science fictional jargon, too. But when you're introducing alien words, you have to be very careful to make sure you have lots of structure surrounding them so that they don't require tons and tons of explanation.
I was thinking, I don't remember exactly which hangout it was when you were talking about if it's a grouse and it looks like a grouse and it sounds like a grouse, then just call it a grouse. And I was thinking that if there was something that there was no comparable animal, that if it looked like a grouse and it sounded like a grouse, but in fact it did these other things that no grouse would ever do, then you can't, you can say, well, it's like a grouse, but it actually does this other thing, and we call it a whatever alien word you want to call it, and then that word will tell the reader that it's different. It really is different from what you're expecting. There is no comparable creature, and then you've got one word, and you could do that with senses. I think if there's a sense that humans don't have at all.
Right.
Then you could say this is what we call it. It's nothing like anything that we have that would identify it as something different without making the readers learn a whole new language, because then
Right.
stand
So
out.
as I see it, there are two ways to approach this question, right? And I think that you're right to apply it to the alien sense question. One is to teach people a new vocabulary for whatever it is that they're experiencing, right? In which case, when you're teaching a new vocabulary, you have to make sure that it's surrounded by information that's going to support it, and make sure that people are clear about what they are understanding. The other thing that you can do, aside from teaching people a new vocabulary, is you can repurpose existing vocabulary, right?
Yeah.
And so, for example, Che was saying some animals taste with their skin. You could start blending the words for touch and taste in English to try to establish this alternate reality that this particular creature would be perceiving. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
You can also redefine existing words and push them sort of culturally and allow them to apply to different contexts in order to create the alien sense. So I wonder if Brian's going to appear.
Brian did appear.
Oh, we're just getting your picture and not your live.
I'm writing down my notes from the last thought.
So the grouse-like creature, we could just modify the name grouse, which is what I was thinking. But there's a number of possible senses that I can imagine that are modifications of ours. For example, you could have a sense in aliens that it's almost like a persistence of vision, where some beings might have a sense, a temporal change where they actually perceive the time in units that are stretched out. Like, for example, you might have a 12 seconds is a unit. So, for example, that changes, like if a person walks across the room, it looks a little like nude descending the staircase, the famous painting.
Yeah.
You know, except perhaps not nude. But the idea is that, you know, you have this form that's extended almost like a tesseract or something in this extra dimension because of that. But we could use our vocabulary, because we experience time in these units, that could be modified to describe something like that without, you know, inventing a whole new vocabulary.
And other senses might be things that we have a word for, even though we don't have a sense. Like a alien that's able to perceive magnetism, or electricity, or so even though we don't have that as a sense word, we have it as a concept.
Right.
That there is such a thing.
And it is.
I'll give you a couple of examples, actually. I have some aliens with a magnetism sense in the Liars, even though they don't talk about it much. They talk about it as feelings, right? Because they talk about the kind of, in a way, we don't talk about our auditory experience of speech as much as we talk about the content of what people are saying. And so the aliens in the Liars had what I called a magnetic channel. But what was being transmitted on that channel was actually emotional information. And so they thought of it as their emotional channel, rather than thinking of it as a magnetic channel.
Yeah.
Because they hadn't analyzed what exactly it was that they were perceiving. if that makes sense. And then there's also the electricity thing. Platypuses. Shall we call them platypi?
Platypi.
Platypi. There's it is. Platypi have these lovely little sensors in their bills that allow them to detect electromagnetism, and what it allows them to do is close their eyes and ears and go underwater and catch food in murky water, because they can actually sense the electromagnetism of their prey, and are quick enough doing that that they can actually go catch it, which is pretty cool. Which is why I decided to borrow that, and I have an actual creature in my Varan world which has a similar electromagnetic sense. But it's not. Well, I mean, Varan is science fiction. It really is. But these creatures are used actually to be security instruments. Like the sniffer dogs that are going around detecting drugs in the airport, or returning belongings to people in the airport, as the most recent usage I saw. But so these guys in the Varan world, they're trained to sense weapons that have battery packs, and and so basically, if you're carrying like a cattle prod or a or something that might be electrical and dangerous, they actually are able to detect it on you and point you out to security. So, I mean, this stuff can be really, really fun, even if you're not in the point of view of the creature that possesses the sense.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know. I think I like my tunnel hounds. They're fun. But I did design them as creatures that had no eyes, and so not having any eyes, they would want to have a way of finding their prey in a different way.
There's an example that I have in my head right now. It's a not very well done example, but it's just in my head because I'm trying to read some science fiction canon. So I'm reading Edgar Rice Burroughs, like the Omnibus, and I just read the Pellucidar series. And if you're familiar with that, you know what I'm going to talk about. There's this race called the Mahars, and they're like basically big lizards, and their method of communication is like they have no ears. So, but it's very strange. It's an interesting idea that's not really used or expanded upon too well. But they communicate with each other by projecting their thoughts into the fourth dimension, which are then retrieved by, I think, well, they can communicate directly, but then they somehow project their thoughts into the fourth dimension, and then a secondary race of ape-like creatures, and then gather that information from this fourth dimension and then translate it to the humans. So that's like a very, it's convoluted and yeah.
Is it
and then
the process comprehensible? I mean, I would assume that it is, given that it's canon.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of get it, but it's like this like very brief mention, and then you have to retain that throughout reading the rest of the book to understand what's happening. But then there's a particular scene where the woman in the world that's new to the world sort of perceives that the way that the Mahars experience music is visually. So that what we would call just sort of a dance troupe doing choreography, that's like the Mahars' version of what a band is.
Oh, interesting.
I don't seem to have the chat part, or I'd ask Shay what she was thinking of. The alien, multiple aliens.
No, it was just the idea I had listening to that of like it would be interesting to have an alien species that they require multiple species to communicate.
A sort of a symbiotic communication thing.
Yeah.
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 Interesting.
Cool.
You can tell when we're just like thinking hard because it gets very quiet.
Well, I'm sitting here trying
And
to
then Reggie's left with nothing to tweet.
I'm trying to think of the word where the people who like experience
Synesthesia.
sound is synesthesia. Yes.
Yeah, I've done a lot of reading. I want to use it somewhere, but
Yeah.
A certain amount of synesthesia is really normal for people working in certain arts. For example, as a musician, I perceive shapes and colors to sounds,
Okay.
and that's very typical.
So is that a the question I always have about that aspect of synesthesia is there any commonality to it? Is there a culture of synesthetes, or is it something where each person perceives in a different way? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think it is very subjective, although everyone knows that the A is green.
Right.
there's.
So I think
That's
you might ask other people and they would tell you that A was something else, right?
Well, I'm making a joke, yes.
Yeah.
It's very subjective.
I saw a documentary on this. I watched a lot of them, actually. And there is... Well, one of the things that is common is that when naming things, like if you show someone a picture of like a soft, roundy shape, and people will, and the question is, does this look like just nonsense word, like say crack, or does it look like an UMA? People will say UMA because it's soft looking.
Right.
So there is, and that's actually pretty universal in names. That's why things like mom and dad are practically the same all the time, everywhere.
Well, yeah, that's onomatopoeia.
Yeah.
And onomatopoeia does have some recognized universal properties.
Yeah.
Association with size and texture involving different areas of the mouth. But it would be interesting, for example, to see how that would play across sign languages, for example.
I want to say one more thing about music.
Yeah,
which is
sure.
that the colors are subjective, but the shapes are not, because the shapes are dependent on whether pitches are going up or down. They're dependent on the tonal qualities of the pitches. So you'd have two musicians actually perceiving the same kinds of shapes and patterns.
Interesting.
So that sounds like it's related to the onomatopoeia question. Interesting. Oh dear. Sorry. I am writing notes. So what was I saying? I lost it now.
left. That would be.
Well, all right.
Stepping back for a second, so the mama and papa, of course, are related also
you.
to ancient languages. So we have we have more than onomatopoeia in terms of those names.
Mm-hmm.
Although they may have come about from that source to begin with.
That's what I was thinking. The primal elements of language probably do relate to that onomatopoeia concept. I mean, those are some of the most common things across all the languages that we have. And yeah, it probably does relate to that's how very first noises were being used to express certain things, because they have that commonality of feeling, like you were saying about the pitch is perceived in the same way, even if color for notes is not. It's
Yeah.
that kind of commonality of perception that is at the root of language.
Like people have a sense of things sounding hard or soft, even though you don't touch a sound necessarily, but it's sort of the same idea.
Yeah.
Right, and you can do hard and soft things in a sign language as well. Though the method of communicating that would be different. That was where I was going, sign language.
Yeah.
So, well, I don't, I'm not an expert on sign language, but I think that this would be an interesting thing to take a look at. I'm currently writing a story that involves sign language, and it's challenging, and the language that I'm using is actually not, it's not a sign language that was initially invented for non-hearing people. And so as such, it actually doesn't have some of the syntactic uniqueness of something like ASL, or Japanese Sign Language, or French Sign Language, or German Sign Language, or there are all different types of sign languages across the world, and it'll be very interesting to do some research into what they have in common. One of the traps, though, and I think it applies not just to sign language but also to auditory languages, this idea that there are prime elements of language and that things are iconic. Because yes, you can have things that are iconic, but at the same time, those icons are culturally defined. And so there will not be a degree of commonality between these areas. So, for example, oh, shoot. This, I believe, is at least part of the sign for boy, and it's supposed to reference baseball caps. But if you don't live in a place where boys wear baseball caps, it doesn't mean anything at all. Right?
Yeah. Well, and girl, it's bonnet. Right?
Sorry?
Girl, that's for a bonnet string.
Oh, a bonnet string, right.
Mm.
So that the language is telling you a lot about the culture of when the language was invented.
Right. Yeah, when the language was invented, for sure.
Yeah.
It's interesting how all this ties in with language, thinking about alien senses, how it would affect things. Did you ever read my story, Jake, Me, and the Zipper? This is probably
I read part of it at least.
That was an old story of mine, but it was that the beings that lived on this particular place, they basically communicated entirely with body language. They had very elaborate ways of communicating things, and also they had tails that allowed them to, to express things while they were doing other things with their manipulative limbs. So.
Well, and a lot of times, a lot of times relates actually back to my point about how we talk about content rather than channel when we're talking about communication. Our communication forms are very, very redundant, and verbal speech is actually paralleled by body language and by facial expression and by a lot of other elements that run kind of in parallel. They create a great deal of redundancy, which helps comprehension in terms of error correction. I think it's actually really, really helpful to have the multiple channels running at once, because if your visual channel is telling you one thing about the body language and your auditory channel fails because there's a loud noise at some point during the conversation, you're more likely to be able to reconstruct what you heard based on what you've seen, right? So even if you're dealing with alien senses, I think it's useful to consider that these are not typically going to exist in a vacuum. They're going to exist in relation to other senses that these people may have, right? And so, I mean, I guess the liars is a good example of this, because one of the things that I was trying to critique in that story was this idea that, well, there could be a group of aliens and their language is so simple, they only have 75 words, right? And it's because they're not particularly bright, right? You know, they're only sort of sentient and whatever, right?
Yeah.
So my idea with this was that, in fact, I was going to invent a language that would appear to be very simple and not to have a lot of words, because humans were not able to perceive one of the key components of the words. And in fact, it was a key component that had a lot of variation. So in fact, that there was a ton of different words, but to humans who couldn't perceive the magnetic channel, they all sounded the same.
Yeah.
And so humans erroneously concluded that this language was actually very simple and didn't have any descriptions of feelings whatsoever, etc., etc. And of course, they were proven wrong later. But yeah, I mean, so I think that's one of the things that you can do with an alien sense is to allow it to operate in concert with some other senses.
Yeah.
Tell us about your topology sense, Morgan.
Well, I just thought of it while we were doing this. But I think what they can do, and it's probably, I don't know, might be a sense of magnetic as well as pressure changes, because that's another thing that we haven't talked about, is the senses and pressure.
Right.
That you can tell, and that might be what they're using to sense, you know, up ahead there's trees here, or there's a cliff there, or, you know, a slight gradient. So I still have to work out the details of that. But I was looking for a sense that was just different for these people, because they have a community relationship with humans, and I've been wondering, what do they bring to the table that humans don't, that would make them, why would they build communities together when they're so very different otherwise?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the one we were talking about it, that I just came up with, which is, you know, one of the reasons it is a cool place to hang out.
You know what you just brought to my mind was Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys remember the blind bandit from The Last Airbender? So she's this young girl who has this incredible ability to do earth bending, okay? And essentially what it involves is she feels a connection with the earth, and she's able to manipulate the earth with her martial art. But in her case, she's blind, and she's become so sensitive to listening to the earth that she can actually always has her feet bare, because when she has her feet bare, she can sense the most minute vibrations all surrounding her, and so as long as something is firmly in connection with the ground, she can actually see it via this special sense that she has. This is fun, you see? This is fun.
Yeah.
Morgan?
Well, see, this is what happens in these discussions. I came into this going, well, we're going to talk a lot about aliens, blah, 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 blah. It's not going to be a very heavy day for fantasy. But on the other hand, you can do this with fantasy as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's classic air, fire, water, earth.
Yeah.
And have
I
different.
have a suggestion for Morgan,
Mm-hmm.
which is, if this particular terrain is treacherous in some way. If the Earth is not stable, if there's areas that are likely to collapse or whatever, your beings with the topological sense could actually tell humans where it's safe to build, places to avoid, where roads could be constructed. You wonder what they could bring to the table. It seems like they could bring quite a lot.
Yeah.
Not to mention the dowsers out of business.
And
well, especially if they were more reliable than the dowsers, that would definitely change the equation.
And I think it might also lead to reason for the communities to split, because if the humans are starting to use the Shakit for that purpose, and started viewing them as tools rather than as people, that might be a bad thing, and split the community. Thanks. Thank you, Rosh.
Yeah, and I can see them actually.
That's very helpful.
Being used as Sherpas.
Yeah.
So there's that too.
I can imagine a topological sense where it's possible to tell where something came from, what form it was in before.
Have you guys mentioned The Particular Madness of Lemon Cake by Amy Bender, I think?
Can you put it in the chat bar, hon?
Yeah. I'm just thinking of it. It's not alien, but it's an extra sense that this a human character develops, where like they taste a bite of food, and you can taste the emotions of the people who made it, or you can tell things about where the ingredients came from. It's similar, but I think it would be a good. It's something to read for that sort of thing.
Well, that like Water for Chocolate does a bit of that as well. That there's this sort of the food carries the emotional reaction of the cook in sometimes catastrophic ways. Well, and one of the things that we haven't really talked about all that much, though, I can't say that we haven't talked about it because this whole discussion has kind of been about it in an indirect way, but we haven't talked about different balances between the senses that we already recognize as existing. Anytime you get a story with a person who can't see, anytime you get a story with a person you can't hear, you have to rethink everything about the way that the story occurs. And ideally, if you're working in our world, you should do some research into the cultures of non-sighted communities and deaf communities, right?
Yeah.
Because those are actually very complex. But at the same time, somebody who has begun with a sense and then lost it is different from somebody who has grown up without a sense. So these are all very, very important questions if you're dealing with alternate sensory experiences. And you know what? I actually think that that autism or the non-neurotypical is an important thing to bring up here as well.
Yeah.
Because those are often associated with differences in perception. The inability to ignore things. A special sensitivities to particular things. And those are going to lead to very, very different kinds of narrative experiences for a character as well.
I can't remember if this was a character or talking about a real person in the autism area about a speed mismatch between vision and hearing.
I read that too. There was an article about whether there was somehow a speed mismatch.
So what they saw at the same pace we would consider normal, but their hearing was delayed, so things didn't match up the way we expect them to.
Yeah.
I don't remember the details, but yeah, speed of perception could vary.
Yeah, like my godson was at a gaming table, and this is an autistic thing. And in order to tell him something like it's dinner time, we're all going to dinner, I have to get his attention first, and that's because he's hearing my voice, but it's not going to register with him until after I've said, forget it, he's not paying attention. But if I put my hand on his shoulder, then he can connect a lot quicker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
That's a touch sense that enhances the speed of hearing.
Right, and I think that's also another example of how the different sensory channels all kind of blend together and influence each other, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I know that when I was a kid and I was reading a book, you could not talk to me. You'd have to come up to me and put your hand on me and go, hey, and then you'd be able to say whatever it was, and it wasn't a problem with my hearing. It was I was in the book, and I just sort of switched my ears off. You know?
Well,
not
I'm somewhat ADHD, but I can also hyper-focus on things, and it used to drive me crazy at work, you know, in your standard cubicle farm. I'd be so focused on what I was working on. Somebody would stick their head in my cubicle, say something to me, and when I didn't respond, they'd walk away. And it was like 5 minutes later, I'd go, what?
Yeah, and then the conversation would be over, and you'd be like, wait.
As writers, I think one of the most important things is to find some reason why particular senses would develop in particular places.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes. Well, you know, a while ago when you were talking about, you know, maybe a race that evolved where there was no light would have no sense of sight. And I was thinking, well, what if they evolved in a place where it was very murky?
Mm-hmm.
So they would they might be able to see the difference between bright and dark, and they might be able to see a little bit of detail up very close.
Mm-hmm.
They might never develop color vision, and vision would be a minor sense, probably, where the thing they really depended on would be something else.
Oh, and actually, this is what you're making me think of. When see, this is what happens. I always get to the end, and I'm always like, but there's more, but there's more. I was thinking of dolphins, right? And animals that live in water and that both communicate and perceive their environment on the basis of sound.
And communicate their environment on the basis of sound, supposedly.
Right.
Sending a complex sound and that will actually allow other dolphins to perceive the environment that the first dolphin perceived.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, having that blend between one's perception of the surrounding reality,
yes,
and the communication of what other people are doing. Plus, you've got the echoes of what the other people sending out the sounds to try to perceive their own environment that enter into your perception of the environment because it's all on the auditory channel. That's fascinating, and it would be really interesting and thorny to try to untangle narratively, I think.
Yes.
So,
yeah, because they're not if they're telling someone about an experience they had, they're not describing it. They're
right.
literally replaying it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which will probably happen with us. as we get our implants, and then 50 years from now we can actually communicate what we're perceiving. Just send it on to the whoever we want to send our little brain email to.
And that is terrifying.
A little bit, yeah. Although by the time that stuff develops, it probably wouldn't be as terrifying, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Step by step,
Remember
right?
the stories. Jacked in. Shoot, I can't remember the names of the stories, but that connected and wired in thing has been done, and you sort of look at it and you say, that's a cautionary tale. Do we really want to go there? And yet, we keep going.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I will mention my story that was in Analog this past year called Mind Locker, and what was going on in that was basically there was this augmented reality that was sort of a cyberspace augmented reality thing, and then it turned out that somebody had hacked it, and was basically doing a psychological priming experiment where they were flashing different images into people's heads when they perceived particular things to try to create poor judgment or anger or fear in the person as they perceived particular things. So yeah, there's a whole complexity there that's possible. But well, I think we're at the end of our time. Thank you all for being here. This has been fascinating. There's obviously always way more we can be talking about. But you all are awesome. And let's see. I think next week's topic is going to be... Oh dear, where is it? I'm going to look this up. If I can.
You have a plan.
I have a plan, unlike most days. I don't always have a plan.
But when I do...
But when I do, man, you guys are totally going to be there with me.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes I just write down ideas in the middle of a... Sometimes I write down ideas in the middle of a hangout, and I go, "Oh, that was a really good idea. I better put that down on my list." Yes. So, so next week, February 25th, 3 p.m. Description across genres.
Ah.
And we will explore that further in the future. So I hope you can be there, and thank you all for being here. Wow, it was a big party today. Love you guys, and time to end the broadcast.